On the night of November 14, 1943, a thick fog crept across the Solomon Sea like a living thing, cutting visibility down to almost nothing as Captain Teisha Yamamoto stood watching from the bridge of his destroyer, the Akatsuki. He smiled to himself as the mist wrapped around his three ships, turning even the closest vessel into nothing more than a shadow in the darkness. For 20 years he had served in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and in countless battles he had learned that darkness was their greatest friend. Japanese crews were trained better than anyone else to fight at night, their eyes sharper, their tactics refined through endless drills. The fog was just another form of darkness, and Yamamoto trusted it completely. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that the very thing he trusted most was about to betray him in ways he never thought possible. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It really does help the channel grow. This is the story of how one piece of technology changed everything about naval warfare in a single night, and how a confident captain's world was turned upside down when he realized that all his experience, all his training, meant nothing against an enemy he couldn't see. Lieutenant Kenji Sato made his way carefully across the wet deck, holding onto the railing as he headed toward the bridge. He was only 26 years old, but he'd already survived 7 major battles in the South Pacific, and the thick fog around him felt safe, almost comforting. He'd grown up hearing stories about how Japanese sailors were the best night fighters in the world, trained to see in the dark, equipped with the finest optical instruments. The fog was just darkness you could touch, and it belonged to them. Captain Yamamoto looked over the mission orders again as Sato stepped onto the bridge. 3 destroyers carrying desperately needed supplies and reinforcements to the garrison at Bougainville, moving under cover of weather so thick that detection would be impossible. American planes would be grounded, their ships would be blind, unable to spot anything in conditions like these. Sure, the Americans had more ships than anyone could count, their factories pumping out vessels at an almost unbelievable rate, but numbers didn't matter if you couldn't find your target. The captain had checked the weather reports 3 times himself. The fog would last at least 8 more hours, plenty of time to deliver their cargo and get back to base before sunrise. His crew of 198 men had trained endlessly for exactly these conditions, learning to navigate by compass and instinct, using carefully shielded signal lamps that could only be seen from extremely close range. Sato spoke quietly, his voice carrying the same calm confidence that filled the entire ship. "We're maintaining course and speed, Captain. We'll reach the delivery point 45 minutes ahead of schedule. The seas are perfect." Yamamoto nodded, his eyes scanning the wall of fog beyond the windows. Out there somewhere, his 2 companion destroyers held their positions, invisible but exactly where they needed to be. He'd served with both commanders for years, trusted them with his life. Together their 3 ships carried 400 tons of ammunition, medical supplies, and food that would keep the Bougainville garrison going for another month. The mission was critical, the conditions were perfect, everything was going according to plan. What Captain Yamamoto didn't know was that 120 kilometers to the south, a completely different kind of crew was watching his every move with perfect clarity. Lieutenant Commander James Patterson wiped his sweaty palms on his uniform and leaned closer to the glowing screen in the cramped radar room aboard the destroyer USS Fletcher. The greenish light lit up his face as he studied 3 distinct dots moving across the display with mechanical precision. Every sweep of the rotating antenna brought fresh data, and the picture was crystal clear. 3 ships traveling in formation, bearing 340 degrees, range 119,000 meters and closing. Seaman Robert Chen, a 22-year-old from San Francisco who had scored in the top 2% of his radar training class, adjusted the controls with practiced ease. The son of Chinese immigrants, Chen had signed up the day after Pearl Harbor, driven by an anger that still burned 3 years later. He'd found his calling in this strange new world of electronic warfare, where being smart and precise mattered more than being strong. Chen said quietly, never taking his eyes off the screen, I'm reading 3 distinct targets in perfect formation. Size suggests destroyer-class vessels. Speed is holding steady at 22 knots. They have absolutely no idea we're tracking them. Patterson allowed himself a small smile. The SG surface search radar humming behind them was the cutting edge of Allied technology, and it had already proven itself in a dozen fights. The Japanese had radar too, sure, but their equipment was primitive by comparison, unreliable and short-ranged. More importantly, Japanese naval doctrine hadn't fully embraced radar, treating it as a backup to traditional visual methods instead of the primary detection system it had become for American forces. Captain William Bradley entered the radar room, his weathered face showing none of the excitement Patterson knew he must be feeling. At 48 years old, Bradley had commanded destroyers since before the war started, and unlike some older officers who viewed radar with suspicion, he had embraced the new technology completely, making it the centerpiece of how he fought. Bradley asked calmly, "Do we have a solution for intercept?" Patterson nodded, already working the math on a small plotting board. Based on their current course and speed, we can position ourselves across their path in about 38 minutes. The fog will keep us invisible to their lookouts until we're within 500 meters. They'll never see us coming until we're right on top of them. The captain thought about this for a long moment, running through tactical options with the speed of long experience. The Fletcher wasn't alone. 2 sister destroyers, the Nicholas and the O'Bannon, cruised in formation 3,000 meters to port and starboard, all 3 ships connected by radio and guided by Fletcher's radar. 9 5-inch guns, dozens of smaller weapons, and torpedo tubes against 3 Japanese destroyers caught completely by surprise. The advantage would be overwhelming. Bradley said finally, "Bring us to general quarters silently, no alarm bells, pass the word by telephone. I want every man at his station, but I want those ships out there to stay completely unaware until the last possible moment." As Fletcher's crew moved to battle stations with smooth efficiency, Captain Yamamoto remained confidently unaware on the bridge of the Akatsuki. The fog had grown even thicker if that was possible, reducing the world to a bubble of gray that extended barely 30 meters in any direction. His ship was a ghost, invisible and untouchable, carrying out its vital mission exactly as planned. Lieutenant Sato returned from checking the interior spaces, reporting that morale was high despite the oppressive conditions. The crew understood how important their cargo was, and they drew strength from the fog that surrounded them like a protective blanket. Several younger sailors had even mentioned feeling safer than they had in months, sealed away from American aircraft and patrols by a wall of mist that made them invisible. Yamamoto shared their confidence completely. He'd fought the Americans since the first days of the war, faced their growing numbers with tactical skill and the advantage of superior night fighting. The fog was just darkness in a different form, and darkness had always been Japan's ally. His lookouts, trained to spot tiny details in low light, scanned the fog with expert eyes, seeing nothing because there was nothing to see. What he couldn't see, what he couldn't even begin to imagine, was the electronic picture building with perfect clarity aboard the Fletcher as Patterson and Chen tracked his every movement. Chen said, excitement creeping into his normally steady voice, "They're maintaining course and speed, no evasive action, no indication they suspect anything. Range is now 42,000 meters and closing at a combined speed of 44 knots. Patterson felt the familiar tension building in his chest, that pre-combat rush every sailor knew. The radar showed the tactical situation with a clarity that would have seemed like magic just a few years earlier. 3 enemy ships perfectly positioned, completely unaware of the ambush forming around them. It was like watching a chess game where only one player could see the board. The Japanese had started this war with real advantages. Their Type 93 torpedo, grimly nicknamed the Long Lance by Allied sailors, was the best naval torpedo in the world, capable of traveling 40,000 meters at 48 knots with a warhead packed with nearly 500 kilograms of explosives. Their optical equipment was superb, their crews expertly trained in night combat. For the first year of the war, these advantages had meant victory after victory. But technology moved faster than tradition, and the Japanese Navy had failed to see that the very nature of naval combat was changing underneath their feet. Captain Bradley stood in Fletcher's pilot house watching the fog swirl past while mentally planning his attack. The radar picture was being continuously updated and sent to his companion ships via secure radio. All three destroyers were moving into position with mechanical precision, guided by electronic eyes that made the fog meaningless. Bradley told his gunnery officer, "Prepare firing solutions for all main batteries. I want the first salvo to be perfect. We may only get one chance before they react and I intend to make it count. Radar will give us exact ranges. The fog will actually help us, hiding our muzzle flashes and making it hard for them to figure out where we are even after we start shooting." Lieutenant Commander Patterson came up to the bridge with the latest plotting data. The tactical picture was developing exactly as expected. In 12 more minutes Fletcher and her sisters would be positioned in a perfect ambush, with 3 Japanese destroyers sailing straight into a trap they couldn't detect. The difference in awareness between the two forces was absolute. Aboard Akatsuki, Captain Yamamoto continued navigating by compass and instinct, trusting his crew's training and the fog that surrounded them. His lookout stared into gray nothingness, seeing nothing because visibility was essentially zero. The ship's own radar, a primitive Type 22 device, was switched off to reduce electronic emissions that might theoretically be picked up by enemy equipment. The irony was profound. Japanese concerns about being detected had caused them to turn off the one device that might have warned them of approaching danger, while American radar operators tracked their every move with casual confidence. Chen said, making tiny adjustments to the controls, range now 27,000 meters and closing. Their formation spacing is perfect, textbook destroyer screen. Estimated time to intercept position is 9 minutes 30 seconds. Aboard Akatsuki, Lieutenant Sato commented to Captain Yamamoto about how smoothly everything was going. The seas were calm, the fog provided perfect cover, and they'd reached their destination with time to spare. Several crew members passing through the bridge wore expressions of relief, grateful for a mission that seemed to be unfolding without trouble. Yamamoto nodded but stayed cautious by nature. He'd survived this long by never taking anything for granted, by always assuming the enemy was more capable than they appeared. Yet even his caution couldn't prepare him for what was about to happen, because he was thinking within a framework that had already become outdated. The engagement started at exactly 0237 hours when Captain Bradley gave the order to open fire. Fletcher's 5-inch guns roared to life, their flashes briefly lighting up the fog before being swallowed by gray mist. The shells, guided by radar-derived firing solutions, crossed 23,000 meters in 28 seconds before slamming into Akatsuki's starboard side. The effect on Captain Yamamoto and his crew was electric and terrifying. One moment they'd been steaming through protective fog, invisible and safe. The next moment shells were hitting their ship with shocking accuracy, coming from a direction where no enemy should exist. Yamamoto shouted, his mind racing to understand what was happening, but there was nothing to see except fog and darkness, no gun flashes to mark enemy positions, no visual clues to guide a response. It was like being struck by an invisible hand. Lieutenant Sato rushed to communications, desperately trying to coordinate with their companion ships while trying to understand how the enemy had found them. The fog was as thick as ever, visibility still measured in meters, yet the Americans were shooting with accuracy that suggested perfect knowledge of their position. The second salvo came 30 seconds after the first, and this time the shells found even more critical areas. Akatsuki's forward gun mount took a direct hit, knocking it out instantly. Fire erupted from the damaged section, flames casting an orange glow through the fog that only made them an easier target for attackers they still couldn't see. Patterson watched the radar as the 3 Japanese ships broke formation, each trying independent evasive moves, but their movements were tracked perfectly by the SG radar, every course change displayed in real time on the glowing screen. The fog that had seemed like perfect protection was revealed as utterly meaningless against electronic detection. Chen said, keeping his professional calm despite the intensity, Target 1 is turning to port, speed increasing to 28 knots. Target 2 is making an emergency turn to starboard. Target 3 maintaining original course but speeding up. All targets remain clearly tracked despite evasive maneuvers. O'Bannon and Nicholas had joined the fight now, their guns adding to the destruction being visited on the Japanese task force. The Americans fired in controlled salvos, using radar to keep perfect track of target positions even as fog made visual targeting completely impossible. It was precision gunnery elevated to a level that would have seemed impossible just years before. Aboard Akatsuki, Captain Yamamoto finally understood what was happening, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. The Americans had somehow found a way to see through the fog, to track his ships with perfect accuracy despite conditions that made traditional detection impossible. The implications were staggering, threatening everything he'd learned about naval warfare over 2 decades. Yamamoto ordered, his voice tight with strain, all ships execute dispersal pattern 7 and increase to maximum speed, launch torpedoes on approximate enemy bearings then disengage at best speed. We can't fight what we can't see. But even as he gave the orders, Yamamoto knew they were inadequate. The Americans could see them somehow, track their every move through fog with perfect clarity, while his own forces remained essentially blind. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre, and there was no tactical solution to being fundamentally outmatched in the most critical area, information. The Japanese torpedoes, launched desperately toward approximate positions, missed their targets by thousands of meters. Without accurate targeting, even the feared long-lance torpedoes were useless, their range and power meaningless if they couldn't find targets. The American ships, guided by continuous radar tracking, moved around the torpedo spreads with ease, never losing contact. Lieutenant Sato, his face lit by firelight from the damaged forward section, came to Captain Yamamoto with a report confirming what they both already knew. 2 of their 3 ships had taken serious damage, combat capability severely reduced. The 3rd destroyer had disappeared into the fog, hopefully escaping, but without any way to coordinate effectively they were reduced to individual ships trying to survive rather than a fighting force. Yamamoto made the hardest decision of his military career, ordering his ships to scatter and attempt withdrawal at maximum speed. It was an admission of defeat, recognition that they'd been beaten by an enemy capability they didn't fully understand and couldn't counter. The supply mission was a failure, the Bougainville garrison wouldn't get its critical cargo, and his task force had been scattered like leaves in a storm. As Akatsuki limped away at reduced speed, trailing smoke with nearly a quarter of its crew needing medical attention, Captain Yamamoto stood on the bridge and replayed the engagement in his mind. They'd done everything right according to doctrine, used weather to their advantage, maintained formation, posted vigilant lookouts, executed textbook evasive maneuvers when attacked. None of it had mattered. Patterson and Chen stayed at their stations in Fletcher's radar room, tracking the withdrawing Japanese ships until they finally moved beyond effective range. The engagement had lasted less than 30 minutes, yet it represented a fundamental shift in naval warfare that would only become more apparent as the war continued. Captain Bradley gathered his officers for a brief after-action discussion while the crew secured from battle stations. Fletcher had fired 127 rounds of 5-inch ammunition and hadn't taken so much as a scratch in return. The radar had worked flawlessly, providing continuous tracking throughout despite weather that had made traditional detection completely impossible. Bradley told his officers, "What we did tonight is going to become standard for naval operations." The fog was irrelevant, darkness was irrelevant, traditional concealment meant nothing. We had perfect information about enemy positions while they had essentially none about ours. That's not just a tactical advantage, that's a revolution in how naval warfare works. The captain was right, though even he couldn't fully appreciate how profound the shift would be. Radar technology would continue advancing at breathtaking pace, each improvement further eroding the advantages Japanese forces had relied on since the war began. The long lance torpedoes, the superior night optics, the extensive training in visual detection, all became secondary when the enemy could see through fog and darkness with electronic eyes. For Captain Yamamoto, the night's engagement marked the start of a painful education in technological warfare. He would survive the war, live to see Japan surrender in August 1945, but the confident officer who'd smiled in the fog that November night was forever changed. He'd command ships again, fight more battles, but never with the same absolute confidence in traditional doctrine. Akatsuki would return to base for repairs taking 6 weeks. During that time Yamamoto filed detailed reports about the engagement, describing how Americans had tracked his ships through conditions that should have made detection impossible. His reports were read by intelligence officers beginning to understand that the Allies had developed radar far beyond what Japanese forces possessed, but understanding the problem and solving it were different things, and Japanese industry lacked capacity to match American technological advances while maintaining existing operations. Lieutenant Sato would transfer to a cruiser in the Philippines where he'd survive until April 1945 before evacuation due to injuries. He'd later describe the fog engagement as the moment he first understood Japan was fighting a war it couldn't win, not from lack of courage or skill, but because the industrial and technological gap was simply too wide to bridge. Seaman Chen would continue operating radar aboard Fletcher until war's end, participating in 17 more surface engagements. He'd return to San Francisco in December 1945, marry his childhood sweetheart, eventually work as an engineer for a company developing commercial radar for maritime navigation. He'd always remember the night in the fog as the moment technology proved more powerful than courage or training. Lieutenant Commander Patterson would be promoted to full commander and given his own ship in early 1944, spending the rest of his naval career advocating for radar technology and training crews in its use. His post-war memoir published in 1953 would include a chapter about the fog engagement, describing it as a perfect example of how information superiority could transform tactical situations. Captain Bradley would retire from the Navy in 1951 as a rear admiral, having commanded increasingly larger formations as the war went on. His final assignment before retirement was helping develop doctrine for integrating radar with naval aviation, continuing the revolution that had begun with simple surface search sets like the one aboard Fletcher. The engagement in the fog on November 14, 1943 wasn't historically significant in terms of ships destroyed or casualties. It would barely get a footnote in comprehensive Pacific War histories. But for the men who were there, it represented something profound, a moment when old rules stopped applying and new realities became undeniable. Japanese naval doctrine built on decades of tradition and refined through years of combat had run into a technological capability that made much of that tradition obsolete. The fog that had seemed like perfect protection was revealed as utterly transparent to electronic eyes. Careful training in night vision became secondary when the enemy could track movements with radar. The advantage of superior torpedoes meant nothing when targeting data was fundamentally unreliable. American forces meanwhile had embraced new technology with enthusiasm born of necessity and supported by industrial capacity that could deploy innovations across entire fleets. The SG radar sets that made the fog engagement possible were being installed on dozens of ships every month, creating a systematic advantage that only grew more pronounced as the war continued. Japanese forces would occasionally achieve tactical successes through courage and skill, but they were fighting an opponent that could see in darkness, track through fog, and coordinate forces with precision traditional methods couldn't match. In decades following the war, naval historians would identify radar development as one of the key technological advantages that enabled Allied victory in the Pacific. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, various engagements around Guadalcanal, surface actions in the Solomon Islands, all demonstrated how electronic detection had transformed naval warfare. Ships that seemed invisible to traditional lookouts showed up as clear blips on radar screens, positions tracked with mechanical precision regardless of weather or lighting. For Captain Yamamoto, standing on a dock in Yokosuka after the war ended, watching American occupation forces move through defeated Japan, the memory of that foggy night remained vivid. He'd been so confident, so certain the fog would protect his task force from detection. The shock of those first shells arriving from an invisible enemy, the frustrated attempts to respond to attackers he couldn't see, the bitter recognition that traditional naval warfare had been fundamentally transformed by technology he barely understood. He would tell the story to his grandchildren years later, describing how confidence and experience had proved meaningless against an enemy who possessed better tools. It was a lesson about pride certainly, but also about the pace of technological change and the danger of assuming traditional advantages would remain permanent. The fog had been real enough, thick and concealing, but it had protected nothing because the Americans weren't using their eyes to see. The Solomon Sea returned to peace in August 1945, its waters no longer contested by warring fleets. Fog still rolled across its surface on humid nights, creating the same conditions that had given Captain Yamamoto such false confidence, but ships that would eventually travel those waters in peacetime carried radar as standard equipment, the technology having become so common it was impossible to imagine navigating without it. And that wraps up our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.